Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I'm Peter Pronovost, and today we're going to be discussing a remarkably simple and effective intervention called daily goals. I'm often intrigued by the attention that this very simple tool has gotten and the results that it has, and yet the simplicity that underlies it. The learning objectives for today are to help you to understand the importance of having daily goals, to understand the basics of communication, and to learn how to implement daily goals in your ICU. And you should easily be able to do that at the end of this session. Let's take a second, though, and reflect on the differences between how we manage our personal or professional lives and the way we care for patients. I've often hear words on rounds being discussed to say the plan is to wean the patient, right? With no more detail than that. And I think for a second it would be like us walking into a meeting with no agenda and saying, what do you want to discuss today? Or having an order be diurese the patient. It would be the equivalent of my wife asking me to do a chore to take out the garbage, and I'll say, oh, I'll do it sometime later. Or a plan that is commonly used to say, oh, continue supportive care or continued current therapy would be like me getting a phone call and my wife asking me when I'm coming home, and I'd say, oh, sometime this evening, I don't know when. Our personal lives and professional lives would be in shambles if we didn't more explicitly articulate goals and what we are trying to achieve. And there's overwhelming data that people and organizations that set goals achieve remarkably more than those who don't. But yet, we often don't apply goals to the management of patients, the management of patients that we are gifted to be able to care for. So why do we need goals, and why bother even thinking about this? Well, because we know that communication failures are common, and in the absence of goals and clear communication, we may have increased errors. That, as I mentioned a minute ago, that there's overwhelming data that if you make goals, whether you're a person or your organization, you will achieve dramatically more than those who do not. I mean, remarkably more. I personally make weekly goals because often my days are too chaotic, but I also make daily goals, and we'll see how making goals for patients could be applied. We also have seen that rounds, the common mode of caring for patients in ICUs, are much more physician-centered rather than patient-centered. And what do I mean by that? Well, they're focused on the clinicians, not on what are the needs of the patient and what does the patient need to have happen. And we need to revise that. And then finally, listen to rounds sometime. What you'll hear is an awful lot of what I would call divergent thinking, that is brainstorming, but very little convergent thinking, that is taking that brainstorming and making a concrete plan. Now, the reality is both forms of thinking are absolutely critical. We need to be able to divergently think, to brainstorm, to come up with differential diagnoses and get ideas of what's going wrong with the patient or how to treat it. But yet, if we end there, we're going to have chaos, and we often walk away not knowing what to do. That has to be coupled with now convergent thinking, where we make an explicit plan and say, okay, given all this, here's what we want to accomplish. The data on collaboration is overwhelming. What we see is that even when matched to the same intensive care unit, doctors rate teamwork twice as positively as nurses do. Now let's think about this for a second. These are doctors and nurses working side by side with each other, supposedly sharing the same experience, and yet doctors say teamwork is great, nurses say it's pathetic. How could that be? Well, I'll tell you that I think in many senses, physicians' view of teamwork may need to be recalibrated. Because I remember from my years in medical school and becoming a new young physician, my view of teamwork, despite playing Division I sports, was if I gave an order, a nurse took it. And if we did that, boy, we were a team, right? I think how naive that was. Then I matured in my view of teamwork was I would on rounds or at the end of rounds ask the nurses if they had any questions or input. And I thought, boy, am I being a real team player then. My view of teamwork now is radically different, where I tap into the wisdom of crowds. We get input from all the care team as we're formulating our plan and making an explicit care plan, what we're going to do. We also have seen that communication errors are the number one contributing factor for all types of sentinel events reported to the Joint Commission. So whether you're in the ICU or the OR and you have a sentinel event, communication failures figure most prominently. And then, intriguingly, when we did the CUSP program, some of you, I hope, remember that program. Well, the second step in CUSP is we ask staff how the next patient is going to be harmed. And when we do that, uniformly, 80% of the staff say it's from communication failures. Now, that's obviously a broad bucket, and we have to narrow down what explicit type of communication problems we're facing, but it's a huge challenge everywhere we look. So what do? Well, we're going to bring this science of patient safety to address this problem. And to refresh your memory, and again, we come back to this all the time because it underlies all of our work, that we have to understand that the system determines performance. So we need to create a system that we clarify goals. And we have some strategies to do that. We can standardize care, we can create checklists or independent checks, and we have to learn when things go wrong. We recognize that these strategies apply to both technical and teamwork, and that the evidence tells us that teams make wise decisions when they can really do two types of things. One is they could have diverse and independent input in making decisions. That is, you get more lenses to see the problem. And second is they have this ability to alternate between divergent brainstorming and convergent focused plans thinking. Here's a model of communication developed or published by Elizabeth Dayton that I absolutely love. It really reflects how we communicate with all of our relationships, not just on our care team, but with our children, our wives, our spouses. And what it says is that there's a sender of information who uses some words, but to a large extent encodes meaning in what they want to say. And that message passes through an often noisy environment. And in this case, it's often spoken, but it could be written or an email. And the receiver then decodes that, both the text meaning and the emotional meaning, to try to interpret what they want to do. So let's think about how this happens. So as you all probably know, if you send an email message in all capitals, that receiver will decode that as this patient screaming at me, even when it may have been I inadvertently put the cap locks on. Or like happened to me, I was needing to get a new passport and I called the post office and the woman on the phone said, the line is out the door or up to the door. And I supposed I was supposed to decode that to mean it was a long wait, but it was really ambiguous. So I tried to say to her, well, could you help me translate that a little bit? Does that mean it's a 10-minute wait? It's an hour wait? It's a 2-hour wait? I was decoding this non-explicit statement. We do the same thing with our families. I know I come home from work often and I, as like you perhaps, get beat up in these roles. And I come home and I'd say, oh, Marlene, I'm so tired today. It was really kind of a rough day at work. And she'll look at me and say, you know, Peter, what you're really saying is you want to go for a jog and not give our kids a bath. And she's spot on. She's right. But because we know each other, we don't risk a translation error in encoding and decoding because we know each other. In our care teams, we often don't have that privilege. So if I make an order that says wean the patient, I have no idea how that's going to be encoded or decoded. Let me give you some ways that we could think about what daily goals give us now. What it does is it creates a standard way to communicate. And if you add explicit criteria on your daily goals sheet, it adds independent checks, such as, is the patient's head of the bed elevated? It helps ensure diverse input, and that is absolutely critical. It adds convergent thinking to what's often divergent rounds, and it reduces these encoding and decoding errors. Let me share with you how we use daily goals. When we make rounds, we have a sheet, and you'll have that sheet available for you, that we use as our daily goals form. The whole care team is present on rounds. We stand, importantly, in a circle to welcome and invite communication. In our case, the resident reads the information, the data from the night before, saying what happened overnight, what's going on with them by systems, neurologically, cardiovascularly, and then the other members on the care team add in at any time new information. We take that in, and then we brainstorm to say at the end, okay, what do we think's going on, and what do we want as our care plan? The doctor then says, okay, the goals for each system are this, this, and this, and then the nurse reads back what he or she heard those goals. Why is that critical? Because we so often have a translation error. They decode it in a different way, that because we weren't explicit, or because it was noisy, or someone was tapping on the shoulder. But what this requires is that there's a perceived value of the nurses attending rounds. And in our ICUs, it's so ingrained now that we won't round on a patient if that bedside nurse isn't there. It's absolutely critical. So what are some strategies or tips for you to thinking about using these daily goals? Well, the first is, I would say, perhaps in all of your communication, be explicit. Don't leave it with vague language like wean the patient, but be more concrete. Cut down on the pressure support by 5, or cut down on the pressure support by 10 within this time period. We've also seen that every organization develops their own daily goals form, and I strongly encourage you not to just take the one we present to you on its own and use it, but have a discussion with your staff and modify it and create your own. But we have seen some really important questions, and they are getting everyone to agree on what needs to be done for this patient to be discharged, either out of the ICU or to home. Because once we've clarified what that goal needs to be, what work has to be accomplished, we could organize our resources to achieve it. So it's if they have to be off vasopressors, okay, we'll know we have to do that. Is if they have to be eating, well, we'll make sure that we're focusing on that. The second really important question is, what are we going to do today, concretely, explicitly, to achieve that goal? And then finally, we've seen it's really important to think proactively about mitigating safety risks, and that is asking, what do we see as this patient's greatest safety risk, and how might we reduce it? It could be, they're at risk of a fall, so let's put some fall precautions. They're at risk for aspiration pneumonia, so let's make sure their head is seated up. Whatever it is, think proactively about risk identification and mitigation. Now, many people add checklist items below these open-ended questions. So under ventilator care, for example, we may ask, is the patient getting peptic ulcer prophylaxis or DVT prophylaxis? Under antibiotics, we may ask some specific things about what they were treating and when they were started, what the bugs grew. And you can modify that yourself depending on the type of patients you care for. The balance is to not be overly burdensome, that it takes too long to complete and therefore nobody will use. As I mentioned, it's critical that it's completed on rounds and that the nurses read back the plan so we don't have a decoding errors. In our hospital, it stays with the patient's bedside nurse. It is not part of the medical record. Some hospitals have made it. I think you just have to test that for yourself. But importantly, modify it to fit your hospital and your local needs. There's no right way to do that, but what you want to be is informed by the science of safety to make sure that you're communicating effectively. Now, what's the data that this really works? Well, we've published a couple papers on that. Again, it's relatively simple, but let me share with you what we did. Before we started Daily Goals, we, from the CUS program, found out that staff feared a communication error as the most likely way patients are going to be harmed. And specifically, the nurse said, we don't really know what the plan of care is. And I don't know how many of the nurses out there now, but I suspect many of you feel like you aren't in the loop about what the plan of care is. I initially found that strange because we rounded and the nurses were often present on rounds. I wasn't thinking at the time of decoding errors. So what I did was we rounded on patients, and then after we left the bedside, I would ask the nurses and the doctors to say, are you clear about the goals that we want to accomplish on that patient we just rounded on? And much to my chagrin, despite spending about 20 minutes per patient rounding, and if you ever see me around, I can pontificate on the evidence and do a lot of divergent thinking and teach, but I wasn't very good about doing convergent, clear goals because only 8% of people knew the goals. So we put in the daily goal sheet. And how do we start it? We literally had this idea. One day on one patient, I said, let's make goals. We have to do something to address this concern. We started on one patient with a piece of paper. It didn't work very well. It was too long. We literally modified it for the next patient, made some revisions for the third patient, and so on. So in the first day, we made an enormous amount of changes. Second day, we made a few. After that, the changes were minimal, but we really used this rapid cycle, small changes to address this problem where we end up with a goal sheet that works. Now, I'll tell you, it's not part of our medical record because to do so has to get the form approved, and we constantly change it. The nurses are constantly saying a new issue comes up or we're doing a new quality improvement program, and they add to it and revise it so we don't use it. The impact on length of stay is profound. We literally cut length of stay by more than 50%. The financial people in the audience will love it. Because of this, we're able to take in 650 new admissions, which provided about $7 million in additional revenue. As you know, hospitals often make money like restaurants by flipping tables. So as you increase throughput, pending you got good food and someone's there waiting to fill the seat, you are going to make money by helping throughput. And this intervention dramatically helps throughput. I'll share with you another story. I made rounds at a well-regarded academic medical center who was working with us, but their staff said, you know, Peter, we don't need this daily goals. We already do this already. We make rounds and everyone knows it. I said, that's great. Let me observe rounds. Perhaps I'll learn something. So I went up there and they were rounding on a patient with heart failure. It was a medical patient. And they had a whole team together, very impressive, the degree of teamwork. And they made rounds, and the plan was to wean, diurese, and get the patient off of nitroglycerin. And they walked away and they felt all proud and said, see how good we're doing. And I called everyone back and I said, well, that's great. What was the plan yesterday? And they said, wean, diurese, get them off nitroglycerin. I said, oh, good. How about the day before? I think it was wean, diurese, and get them off nitroglycerin. We were on day 3 now of an admission. And I said, and did you make any progress towards that? And they said, well, not really. I know we wanted to diurese, but I guess we were actually positive every day. The patient has gained some fluid, and no, I guess we didn't really make much progress on the ventilator. So I said, oh, okay, why don't we try this different approach then? What needs to happen to get this patient off your ICU? Well, they can't go intubated, and that's going to require us that we get fluid off them, and they can't be on IV nitroglycerin. I said, okay, great. Now we have a plan. Now we know what we have to accomplish. What do you want to do today? Okay, I want to wean them. I said, okay, well, let's be a little more concrete. Why don't we put them on pressure support ventilation and do pressure support weaning? Maybe why don't we just try them on some T-piece trial, look like they're breathing okay, and see what we can do. And diuresing, we need a goal. So do you want 2 liters, 3 liters, and by when? Okay, so let's make a goal 3 liters by 3 o'clock, and the nurse could titrate diuretics to get us there. We don't need to be in that loop. They could just, if that's where we want to go, give them Lasix to get us there. And how about getting them off Tridol? What's going to be, or the nitroglycerin? What's your plan for that? Okay, well, we started a calcium channel blocker, so let's just shut it off in an hour after we give that. Their eyes lit up, and they saw a whole different way of approaching patient care. So we rounded on the next patient, and I left. About 3 months later, I get a phone call from the unit director and their CEO. They said to me, Peter, we really want to thank you for opening our eyes about how to make goals on care. And I said, well, this isn't super complicated. It's just basically blocking and tackling. And they said, well, no, I don't think you understand. You've shaved off 3 days from our average ICU admission. Our heart failure admissions are down 4 days. And it's the same people, but we're just managing the work in a much more structured way. And the results are just dramatic. So what's your action plan, and what might you do? Well, I would encourage you to present this idea of daily goals to your ICU team. If you've already done CUSP, then discuss with them what communication problems they're having. And if one of them are, which I suspect it will be, their staff don't know what the goals for the day are or what the care team wants to do, then consider using these daily goals. I would start by drafting a daily goals form, use ours as others as a pilot, but really get your own input. Your staff have wisdom. They know what important issues are, and create your own. You're going to need support from one or more physicians. So I would speak personally to an ICU physician who may be engaged in this to get them to agree to pilot test or to put into it. And whenever we're implementing a change project, we always have to make sure we tune in to WIFM. It's perhaps one of the most important radio stations that you'll learn about, and it stands for What's in It for Me. And that is, when we get resistance to doing these problems, we often hear the statement, people resist change. And I think that's a misnomer, because if I were to give you a lottery ticket that won $10 million, it would most likely change your life. It would certainly change mine. And very few of you would give it back and say, oh, no, Peter, I can't take it. It's going to change my life. I don't want change. I'm afraid of change. We don't fear change. We fear loss. And what we need to do is surface what is that lost, or more often perceived loss, and try to mitigate that. In these quality projects, most of the loss is time, or some of it is status and control. But in this case, the docs are going to say, do I really want to take time to do this? And so we have to demonstrate that it's in their best interest. And one really simple way to do it is to monitor the number of times that you page physicians. We showed that we reduced pages to physicians by 80%, literally 80%, by clarifying explicitly what the goals are during rounds, made sure the nursing staff understood what those goals are, and then we didn't have to call them an hour later saying, what did you really want to do with Mr. Smith? Because we addressed it appropriately the first time. And we've seen many hospitals have seen this dramatic reduction. And so monitoring pages is a great way if you want to demonstrate WIFM. I would also encourage you to start small. Pilot test on one patient, on one bed, on one day, and then expand so that this is the way of doing work in your ICU. We have to begin to apply the science of safety to the way we deliver care. This is a very practical, concrete strategy to put some of that science into practice, and I have no doubt it'll improve patient care, it'll reduce cost, and it'll put enormous amount of joy back into your daily work. This is Peter Pronovost working with you to improve patient safety. Enjoy the day.